What's up, y'all? Rooster McNuggets. Welcome to my new casa. So I'm just gonna jump on into it tonight. What are we talking about? We're talking about the illusion of free will. Why? Because what shit's been fucking with me, right? It's a fairly persistent illusion, and the implications of not having free will freak people out. Like, I have no agency. Fuck. So, yeah, let's talk about this a little bit, right? So it doesn't mean that you don't have any agency, because you basically have two perspectives, right? You have the perspective that everything is tied into everything, and so there is a cause and effect on every plane of level, and so we're governed by all kinds of different factors at all times, innumerable, one being our body, and its dynamics and all of that stuff. So you can look at it from that interrelated objective standpoint, and that's no free will, right? Or you can look at it from a subjective perspective of ignorance. So let's say that if the interconnected perspective was all knowing at all times, then the the subjective perspective on the other side of the spectrum, as it were, if it was all one, would be ignorant, or nescience, actually, it's like a lack of. Is that you have the capacity to know these things, but it's just not there. It's as opposed to something that you're ignoring. So so you have those two perspectives that you're wrestling with. It's from a subjective perspective. From the objective, no free will. From the subjective perspective, it seems as if we have choice, right? And so that's what everybody's always talking about. Well, you can't have love if you don't have free will, right? So, well, I beg to differ, So, I think you can have love without free will, and that doesn't mean that there isn't agency. So, what do I mean by this difference between agency and free will? Okay, so let's walk this back. So, when we're in the moment, right? We already decided that. Well, I'm going to lay a standard that whatever happens in the moment is what is. So that's the deciding factor. So we may be able to frame up something or talk about how things are, or how we are in reference to ourselves, but when the test comes, the test is how people act, what happened, how did they behave, and what does that describe. Now, people will justify and give reason for all justifications for why they behaved out of what would be seemingly out of line of what they said their worldview was. They'll say, well, no, that's because of this and this and this. But what I would say is that's all bullshit. Like, the way that we act, what happens is the test. That's how much spirituality that we have. Everything else is desires and hyperbole and just imagination. So how does this decision process work? How do we come into this perception of choice, right? So when we're in the moment, we react. It's instantaneous. There's no response. Now, when we are reflecting, we look back and we go, oh, there were all of these different factors that came into play prior to that, and that's why I acted like that. But that's in reflection. That's not in the moment. So when you're actually in an activity, you can't reflect on these things. I mean, to a limited extent, right? But if you're commanded to respond to certain things, your ability to reflect is narrowed, to say the least, right? So so if okay, so you're coming up to it. So you're acting out, or we're acting out of a position of now, and we are when we reflect, we realize that we it was the result of a bunch of different causal factors. Okay, so there's no free will in that, but when we reflect, we also look back and go, well, I could have done this, or I could have done that, right? Okay, but you could not figure out what you could have done unless you first realize what is. So, and realizing what you could have done is also a reflection. So, so by acknowledging what is when in reflection, then we come to, and at that point, then we try to reposition and take another slice, and take a different perspective on on what we just summarized. And so it's but we couldn't get that new perspective until we had summarized. So that's not a choice, because it wasn't available until we summarized. So actually, we don't actually get new information, novel information, until we understand what is. So, well, that's what we're always doing, because we can reflect, but that's using our imagination. What we're actually after is what is. And so so by coming to what is and agreeing what always has been, then we have more agency to see other potentials, other perspectives, other ideas. But until we come to grips with where it's much like a map. There's no way to get to there until you figure out where you're at, you know? So, yeah, the kingdom is within you. There's nowhere to go. Yeah, so when I thought of this, I was reminded of Bill Hicks, and it was like, just put out your hands, your arms, and enjoy the ride, because, well, that's comforting, to think on those terms, to realize that these things are determined. Though determined, though, depending on how much attention we give them, we can have more agency in those factors, those ranges of potentials, those capacities. So, anyways, just a quick summary of the illusion of free will. What we really have is agency when we come to an acceptance of what is.